Hi, this is Eternal King here bringing you another LOR video today. So I wanted to do some standard deck evaluations, which I do from time to time. Basically the way that I approach it as the top player in Eternal is I look at the new standard decks that have arisen in the meta and then discuss whether or not I think they are Eternal viable. Um, and if they are not Eternal viable, discussing why I think that is. So the two big new decks that have come out of the two big new decks that have come out, it's all Eddy decks, right? Standard is all Eddy because Standard has always been a balancing nightmare. Essentially, the way they've decided to fix Standard, like a little preface, right? So the way they've decided to fix Standard in PvP 2.0 is that they're just going to rotate the Standard card pool every 2 months. So like every time a new standard ranked season opens up, they're just going to do a small rotation of cards. And that's the only way that they can balance standard is to effectively just limit what your card choices are in the format over and over again. That way no one deck becomes too prevalent. Season over season is just to effectively reduce your access to that card. Because what we're seeing is that in season one of, like the rotation one, Eddy was everywhere. Rotation two, Eddy is everywhere. Because at the end of the day, when you don't have access to things like proper removal, when you don't have access to things like proper synergies, Eddy is always going to be the best choice because you put one copy in the deck and then all of a sudden every archetype is better. When you don't have access to proper archetypes. That's the way I would preface this. So what we're seeing here, for example, is the top win rate deck in Standard on Runeterra AR is Eddy Elites. You know, it's an elite deck where you're playing high tempo followers, so Cythria, Trusted Ramhound, Battlesmith, Form Up, Vanguard Defender, Blocking Badger Bear, Gentleman's Duel, Vanguard Sergeant, Vanguard Squire, Silverwing Vanguard, Silverwing Flight, and then Garen. So like just normal elite stuff. For those that don't know, elites are not one of the best archetypes in Eternal. It's just flat out not the case. It's a fine tribal deck. As far as the history of LOR goes, it's a fine tribal deck. And then you play Garen on 5. Now, of course, the whole point of this deck is that you're playing things like... First of all, I don't know if this works properly with Eddy. I believe that if Ardent Tracker gets mana reduced, it no longer counts as a 6 mana play. And therefore no longer gets the benefit from Eddy, but I might be wrong on that interaction. It's possible that Ardent Tracker is unique, but the way it usually works is that if you mana reduce a 6 mana card, it no longer gets the benefit from Eddy. But again, if that's not how it works, let me know. And then you have Cythria coming down with Deathless, Genevieve coming down with Deathless, Captain Farron coming down with Deathless, and then just your one off of Eddy. So again, this deck's not even much of an Eddy deck because as far as I can tell, Ardent Tracker's getting mana reduced, so you're not getting the Eddy play off of it. Or maybe as a top deck, you're getting the Eddy effect. But then if you have it in hand, it gets mana reduced. So like it's okay on tempo, and then it's okay as a top deck. And that might be how it works out in reality. But either way, this deck isn't, good in terms of Eternal. Like, in terms of Standard, it's very possible that playing a Standard Elite package with just an Eddy top end is good enough. But by Eternal standards, this deck is kind of awful. Just flat out awful by Eternal standards. I can't really put it any other way. Things like, the one-off of Captain Farron. Again, it's pretty eh. It's not the kind of thing you would see in Eternal most of the time. Again, if you want to run one and something like Swain Nora, like I don't think it would be the worst thing. Like as long as you had the proper control package to get you to mana 8 where the 2 decimates are relevant, it might not be that bad. But again, most of the power would be in, for example, the Swain Nora core package, just kind of carrying you, regardless of the Captain Farron. And plus, you'd be running Swain Boat at that point, and Captain Farron would be kind of competing with Swain Boat. So, like most of the decks that I think of, you're just better off not trying to do this, which is just like core tempo package that is a little underwhelming into a random Eddy top end. But that's what you're going to see in the next deck as well. The next top deck in Standard is Braum Eddy. So again, it's just going to be Omen Hawk tempo package, Snow Dog tempo package, Braum on 4, you know, some value 4 drops like Combat Cook, Glacial Saurian for the, because it cycles, and then, you know, I don't know, 2 Ultra Soft Poros, like, okay. And then, yeah, this one is very heavy on the Eddy. So this is like a proper Eddy deck. Very heavy on the Eddy, and the rest of this stuff doesn't matter, really. It's just delaying the game out. And yeah, so Cloud Drake, pretty common Eddy card. Swarm Caller is a one-of, pretty common. Sheriff Lafayette, you know, again, grants all enemies vulnerable, so you can drag them with your Eddy cards. Fine. Ancient Yeti is fine. Again, like, you know, when you start getting into things like Beguiling Cobra and Warden of the North, Warden of the Tribes, you're like, oh boy, this is a standard deck. Like, I don't think there will be a world in Eternal where Warden of the Tribes is the best Eternal is the best Eternal card. It's not happening. It's never happening. Not in a million years. So again, this is kind of like standard stuff, right? Where it's just like some sort of tempo early game, whether it is elites or it is Omen Hawk into Snow Dog, and then just, you know, not going off until turn 6 with just random Eddy card pile stuff. Not good enough by Eternal standards, not by any means. Like, you want to talk about decks that I would rather run than that elite card pile? Honestly, you'd be better off running birds. Like you want to talk about just like consistent tempo value stuff, like just run like Omen Hawk and Snow Dog with a birds package and some, you know, with Garen, which again, the Garen is the right call, and, you know, Royal Shimmerwing on 5, and like Talon Strikes, you get a little bit of removal, and then Ferocious Fluffs on 7, and like, frankly, you'd be better off. You would literally be better off running this like Tempo Birds package than Eddy. It's kind of hilarious. It's kind of hilarious. In Eternal specifically. Because again, in Standard, right, you just play like big stuff on 6+, and like there's no flocks, there's no disintegrates, there's no proper removal. So obviously just playing like 6 mana stuff with Eddy is amazing in Standard. There's just nothing to stop you from doing so. But like, you know, in Eternal, one of the top decks is just Bandletree, right? You slam Bandletree, and then you just flock and disintegrate all your opponent's big plays with pings, and then you just win, right? You just win the game. You will, and you can play Aloof Travelers to like force the opponent to discard their Eddy. And yeah, this deck will just like insta-win into that, because it is a proper deck, right? Like, that's the difference between Standard and Eternal. Standard is like card piles with Eddy top end, usually some sort of tempo package followed by a top end 6 drop package that is value in the Standard format, and nothing else in Standard can compete. And in Eternal, it's the opposite. It's like actual deck constructions with actual win cons and things of that nature. I really can't emphasize that enough. So let's just auto delete those 2 Eddy decks. I am never playing either one of these decks. They are Garbo. Pure Garbo. Things that you would, you know, other decks you'd be better off playing. You know, Standard Zed Gwen. Standard Zed Gwen would feel fine. You know, like 2 Opulent Foyers, 2 Black Flames, and then just your standard Zed Gwen package is going to feel better in Eternal. Any of my like weird brews will feel better in Eternal. So, you know, you want to talk about like removal for Eddy. I love when people play Eddy into this deck. And it's basically just nothing but proper, you know, top end answers. Like in Eternal, you can play a Husk and then crumble a Husk, right? Which is not something you can do in Standard. Like they rotated out Crumble, right? And they rotated out Kindred. But like if people play Eddy into something like this, where it's like Vengeance, Crumble, Death's Grasp, Hate Spike, Glare, there's just nothing they're going to be able to do, because your Kindred's going to eat their 6 drops for free, because you're basically going to Hate Spike the small thing, or Death's Grasp the small thing, or Vengeance the mid-range thing, and then Kindred's going to eat the big thing for free, because Kindred doesn't care how big the card is. So like that's just the format differences. Is like, here's an example of like a Shadow Isles control package that will instantly eat every single Eddy deck in the game. Before I showed you a Noxus control package that will eat every single Eddy deck in the game. Eddy is bad. Like, I made a video saying like, is Eddy bad now? And I actually think that since the new expansion, Eddy's kind of bad. Obviously not in Standard, because Standard's a mess and has been a mess since Standard has been a thing. And the only way to fix Standard, and they're doing the right thing now with PvP 2.0, the only right way to fix Standard is to constantly rotate Standard. And they've kind of figured that out, where it's just like whatever is in Standard is going to be overpowered in Standard, just because there's a very limited card pool. So if Eddy's in Standard, every deck will be an Eddy deck. If they rotate Eddy, it'll be the next thing. Whatever the next thing is will be everywhere in Standard. And it used to be like, for example, if they rotate out Eddy and they rotate in Lurk, Lurk will be like the top deck in Standard again. If they rotate out Eddy and they bring back in, say, like some sort of like Auction with all the best Auction cards, Auction will be the best card in the game. Like it's all relative. Or if they rotate out Eddy and they rotate back in Aurelia, let's just say they allow Azir Aurelia to exist in Standard as is. It will instantly destroy every single Eddy deck in the game. They don't even have to rotate out Eddy. They can just rotate in Azir Aurelia, and then all of a sudden Eddy stops being a thing. You just Defiant Dance the Eddy with the Emperor's Army and stuff like that, and like it's just instantly over. Like, Eddy is not a good card. I've got to be honest here. There are specific archetypes where Eddy can do work. Very specific archetypes where I can like make firm Eddy recommendations, where Eddy has been good enough for Eternal. Something like They Who Endure, right? So They Who Endure has been a deck that has proven to be good enough by Eternal standards as an Eddy shell. Because it turns out that when you play a massive Overwhelm unit that can OTK you, it's generally better to do so with Deathless. Like, that's kind of the power scale of like when Eddy is good enough. He grants Deathless to a 2020 Overwhelm unit. Yeah, that's good enough for Eternal. Or again, you play like a Viego. If you're more of like a synergy focused player like I am, you play a Viego with Deathless, and then you guarantee his flip, right? Like that's good enough. Or you give him another keyword that's useful, or you play the Viego and then you're healing your Nexus. You play the Grim and you're healing your Nexus. Like, you just, Invasive Hydravine with Deathless. Like, these are kind of the levels of play where Eddy is good enough. Eddy is good enough on Grim. He's good enough on Viego. He's good enough on Hydravine. He's good enough on They Who Endure, obviously. That was a big deck in Eternal for a Heartbeat. Even now it's not anymore, but like for like a Heartbeat, it was a good enough deck to play They Who Endure with Eddy. But yeah, Eddy is increasingly falling off in Eternal. And obviously in Standard, where you have no alternatives, he's going to be everywhere. But like we just looked at like Eddy Elites, and we looked at Eddy Braum, and I think both of those decks are a card pile. And not a good card pile, like a joke card pile. What would you be better off playing in Eternal? Literally anything. You can play Draven Riven with a burn finish, and it would be a better deck than Eddy. You just play Blade Squire, and then Runeweaver, and then play Draven or Riven, and then get value there. And even if they strike the Draven or the Riven, it won't matter because you're pushing like nothing but burn in the deck, along with like a Raged Fire Spitter top end, Decimate. You could debate whether or not the Static Shock needs to be there, but I think you need a little bit of cycle power for this deck to function. And then, yeah, you can just like get excited all your Blade Fragments, or when they try to remove the Draven or the Riven, you can Auction Fervor them into face. And like this would eat Eddy for dinner. Like breakfast, lunch, and dinner, this would destroy Eddy decks. Because it's not a card pile, right? It's a deck that knows what it's trying to do. Even if you're running like a suboptimal champ selection, it doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, the construction is otherwise pretty solid. So this is Eternal King signing out. I just want to talk about like the differences between Standard and Eternal. They are fixing Standard in PvP 2.0, and they're going to fix it by just constantly rotating the card pool every 2 months. Just rotate. That's the only way to keep Standard fresh, because Standard will never be a balanced format. It never has been a balanced format. But at the very least, we can keep it exciting. This is Eternal King signing out.